Welcome to Local Government Matters. Today, we are discussing the logic of democratic local government legislation in South Africa. We've spent a considerable amount of time in the last few podcast episodes discussing the 1998 white paper in the context of, one, the white paper review that's underway, but secondly, the legislation that it resulted in, giving rise to the architecture of local government in South Africa. We are very privileged today in that we have the two people, the one who have been involved with the legislation and in implementing the legislation, that is Johan Mettler, in conversation with Jaap de Visser, Professor Jaap de Visser, who is at the Dalla Umar Institute and a foremost thinker and contributor to the local government, understanding of local government in South Africa and the challenges and issues. He has written extensively and he's quoted extensively, even in court judgments, with respect to local government. I'm going to hand it over to Johan and he'll be in conversation with Jaap. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Yeah, it's good to meet up with you again. It was in fact local government that brought the two of us together way back, if I remember, in 1998. How did South Africa's democratic aspirations shape the legislative choices made at that time? And that time, we talk about from 95 onwards, even starting with the Local Government Transition Act. And what was at stake in those early legislative efforts? Yeah, you can take it from.
Thanks so much, Johan. And it's good to be with you and a privilege and an honor to be part of this initiative in this podcast series. Yeah, indeed. It was 1998, I think, that was the year in which we connected up around local governments. I had just started off as an intern working in Parliament in the NCOP as part of my master's program at the University of the Western Cape. I had only been in South Africa for about a year and a half, fell in love with the country and all the issues that were at play at that time. A very exciting time. Was doing my master's with, believe it or not, a master's thesis on Section 139 interventions. And as part of my internship in Parliament, I then connected up with you, and I remember phoning you at some point for some advice on what was happening in local government legislation. It's been, the rest is history, as they say. It's been a rocky ride ever since, and that's where my love for local government and passion for intergovernmental relations and the developmental backgrounds to local government, that's where it all started. Yeah, so setting the scene, obviously I was compared to you and many others that have come before me in this podcast series, a Johnny come lately. I only joined the debate in 1997, 1998, but it soon became very clear to me that this was a monumental change that was happening in South Africa. I remember the first day that I entered Parliament and I was brought into a meeting with two gentlemen that I didn't know from a bar of soap, but they were Honorable Yunus Karim, who was then Member of Parliament, of course, and Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Local Government, and Honorable Mohammed Baba, who was also a Member of Parliament at the NCOP and Chairperson of the Select Committee on Local Government. And the two of them pulled me aside and said, welcome. You are now an intern here at the NCOP, and the things that are going to happen in the next couple of months in this Parliament are going to change South Africa forever. I had no idea what they were talking about, but the first thing they did was throw a copy of the Municipal Demarcation Bill at me. And I said, why don't you have a read through this and see what you make of it? You're a lawyer and you're doing a master's, so we can use your inputs. And in that same period, there was also the Municipal Structures Bill that entered parliamentary process that I then engaged with. And of course, it soon became very clear to me that this was, as I said, a monumental transformation, with local government until then essentially being undemocratic, certainly until 1994, 1995, the first local government elections. It was obviously fundamentally undemocratic, and local government was fragmented across racial lines, different municipal entities for different racial categories, large parts of the country not being covered by any form of local government other than traditional leadership. The transformation was immense. And I remember that one of the biggest issues was the time pressures of the constitutional deadline, because there was a constitutional deadline of local government elections to be held in, I think it was initially 1999, but later it was postponed to 2000, something like that. I can't remember the exact details, but there was huge pressure to pass this legislation because it was the outcome of the white paper process that had been completed in 1998, that there was going to have to be a suite of legislation to give effect to the vision of the 1998 white paper. And all of that was, what was interwoven through all of that was, as you say, Johan, the democratic aspirations around local government, that local government was going to be much more than just a retailer of services, much more than just a appendage of national and or provincial governments, but a government in its own right, democratically elected with constitutionally protected powers and a developmental mandate. But the stakes were high because of the time pressure and because of the very complicated legislative agenda. I remember I was privy to, at that point, the ANC study group in Parliament. I was allowed to attend. And I remember that one Monday morning, it was an ANC study group meeting, and Milan, the ANC MP, had been given the task to dissect and understand this new bill that had been tabled called the Municipal Structures Bill. And she led that meeting with a presentation on the Structures Bill, what it said about categories and types. And it was all very overwhelming and complicated. And from there on, we just started chipping away at the issues and slowly but surely making sense of it. But yeah, I remember there was this mixture of democratic aspirations, monumental change, and tremendous haste. So that's what I remember from those times, Johan.
I think, yeah, you're quite correct. It was, in fact, the democratic aspirations that was the main, that were the main impetus. It was the main impetus at that time. And one also has to take into account the history where the majority of South Africans were excluded from especially local government. And in fact, there was a fight at the ground level against the structures, white supremacy. So the idea of not participating and the idea of not paying for services, that was part of what had to be undone. So that was at stake. And early legislative efforts then put the councillors front and center. So councillors had to drive the democratization of government. Now, having said that, in your opinion, how well did the Structures Act and the Systems Act live up to that white paper's logic? Did the laws provide sufficient clarity on the roles and the responsibilities and the powers? And what do you think were the unforeseen tensions that emerged between local autonomy and national oversight?
It's obviously, it's quite a few questions in one, and there's so many layers to those issues. I think, first of all, I think the point must be made that the legislative framework that we have with the Structures Act, Systems Act, but also the MFMA and Demarcation Act and Intergovernmental Relations Framework Act, etc., is a suite of legislation that many countries marvel at. We have a well thought through legislative framework. There's no doubt that it's well thought through and that it, in principle, lives up to the promise of the white paper. Particularly if you look at, I think, the Municipal Systems Act and what it sets out in terms of intergovernmental integrated development planning, public participation, service delivery. I remember the discussions around the Municipal Systems Bill, how Parliament agonized over the issue of, for example, under what circumstances can a municipality put a service outside of the municipality. There was fierce debates. Obviously, it was a very principled issue, the specter of privatizing municipal services and leaving it to the private sector. So there was very principled discussions. It's just an example of one of those many principled discussions about how we deliver on the promise of the white paper of a developmental local government. If you scratch the surface of that sort of, in principle, agreement that, yes, it's a good set of laws, there are many unforeseen tensions, which are difficult to walk back. One example, it may be even a contentious example, and people may not like me for saying this, but I always make the point with my students to say this issue of the office of the speaker which is established by the Municipal Structures Act, that we have an office of the Speaker, that we have a chairperson of council, which is a separate office from the office of the mayor. I ask my students to look at the Constitution and tell me, does the Constitution demand that? Because the answer is no. That is a choice that's not made in the Constitution, but it's a choice that's made in the Municipal Structures Act. So the Municipal Structures Act makes a choice that we shall have an office of a Speaker and an office of the mayor as two separate offices in each municipality. And I remember, Johan, the two of us, when we were working together at the Community Law Center at UWC at the time, in those late 90s, early 2000s, then already we ran endless workshops for SALGA, with municipalities, trying to make sense of who's going to do what. And it may be one of those issues, and I'm saying it's difficult to walk back. You can't walk that back now. But a choice was made to create two bulls in one kraal, so to speak. And now we have to make sense of that and implement it. And there are many other, I think, issues that one can point at. I'm also, for example, still not entirely convinced that the institutionalization of ward committees, to the extent that it's happening in the Municipal Structures Act, has that assisted public participation? Has that facilitated public participation? Or has it turned ward committees into basically an alternative site for politics, not really a vehicle for genuine bottom-up civil society and community engagement with local government? So there are a number of areas in the Municipal Structures Act and in the Municipal Systems Act where I think there are unforeseen consequences. I also remember the early debates and work that we did on implementing the framework for integrated development planning, as it is legislated in the Municipal Systems Act. And now every municipality had to produce an IDP as of the year 2000. And now, of course, all of us know the crucial importance of integrated development planning. But actually, it was a choice in the Municipal Systems Act to legislate that, because one could also argue IDP it's simply strategic planning, which any big organization ought to do. But we've made it a legislative instruction, and we've built an edifice around that with regulations, etc. Has that produced the kind of quality strategic planning in municipalities? It's a question. And maybe let me end off with the remark that in all these legislation, in the Structures Act and Systems Act, and to a lesser extent the MFMA, there was still, I think, too much the notion of we are going to legislate the same framework for all municipalities, whether you are both in our local municipality in the Eastern Cape or you are the city of Johannesburg. This is the framework that shall apply to you. And I think that is something that should have been paid much more attention to right from the onset, knowing full well that those are two different ends of a very wide spectrum. So yeah, those are just a few observations on that score, Johan.
I do think also, just to add to that whole contestation at the local level between the mayor and the speaker, and we had endless engagement with municipalities in that regard. And then, of course, later on, there was another animal that came into being, and that is the chief whip. And the chief whip was then put in place to manage to help the speaker to manage party discipline. So all of the party discipline within the council would then resort under the chief whip, dealing with all of the whips of the various political parties, which of course created another center. And lo and behold, soon there were issues around that. But I think one of the unforeseen tensions that also, and it has to do sometimes, not all the time, but with a little bit of apartheid legacy, because there are some areas in our country which then turned out to be predominantly one political party and then others another political party. So the issue around local autonomy and national oversight then started to play itself out. And I think, for example, in the early days, it was KZN, the IFP was most in charge in the early years, and also in the Western Cape, where there was also the national position that would be in charge largely. So the issue between what is local and what can we do and national, and then we started seeing more and more national regulations coming out, more prescriptive legislation. And soon we started to look at this thing that's called the over-regulation of local government, or as you once put it the strangulation of local government. So we had that playing itself out, as well as the rule that we call it in legal language, the principle of subsidiarity, which I'll ask you to explain, that which can be devolved at the lowest level must be exercised there. So you put those two in contradistinction to each other, the strangulation, and then also the principle of subsidiarity. Can I just give you thoughts on that? But also tell us in plain, simple language, what is this thing, subsidiarity?
With pleasure. Let me first, I'm an academic, so I'm always very mindful of credits and references. The term strangulation was coined by our good friend and colleague, Nico Statler. He was the one who came up with that term. And so that he deserves the credit for that, because that really became, I think, almost like a buzzword. And he wrote a very influential paper on strangulation of local governments. And of course, we all followed in his footsteps and continued to make sense of that concept, which I think links to subsidiarity, as you pointed out. So subsidiarity as a concept, I think there's two ways of understanding it in the South African context. The one is as a general notion, not as a legal principle, but as a general notion that, as you explain it, generally a pressure to let the lowest level of government deal with as many issues as possible. And so in that sense, it is part of our constitutional configuration. I think that is why we have schedules, 4B and 5B, as almost a general outflow of that subsidiarity thinking that the constitutional drafters had. With a big, I think, disclaimer there, and this is on me being a critical academic, that if you really look at the schedules and you scratch the surface and you also understand a little bit about the history of how those schedules were put together, those who were in those rooms, those smoke-filled rooms where, the Constitution was drafted, they will tell you in all honesty that, listen, we just cobbled together some old local government ordinances. We looked at what was there and we hustled it around a bit and we put it in the schedules. And from the ANC's side, the thinking was really, how do we squeeze provinces as much as possible, give them as little as possible? And how do we boost national government and local government? And that was the game plan. And voila, there is the schedules 4B and 5B, which we're still struggling to understand some of those choices. Nevertheless, it's an expression of subsidiarity, the protection of local government, on the basis of the thinking that we should leave as much power as possible, as close as possible to communities and residents. So that's the one understanding of subsidiarity. So there's a general thinking underlying the Constitution. There is, however, also a more specific legal principle in the Constitution, which I think is going to play an increasingly important role going forward. It hasn't yet, not at all. It's one of those, I almost call it a dead letter in the Constitution. But Johannes, section 156(4) of the Constitution says that national and provincial governments devolve further powers to municipalities that are capable of exercising those powers, and if that power is most effectively exercised at local government level. There's something to that effect is in section 156(4). So that's actually the only place in the Constitution where the Constitution says we don't expect this division of authority between national, provincial, and local to be static. We expect it to move. We expect it to progress. We expect municipalities to start claiming further authority as long as they're able to do so and as long as it makes sense. So that is an expression of subsidiarity. It is not subsidiarity per se, because the real origins, and this is now where I become a little bit academic, the origins of subsidiarity are, believe it or not, in Roman Catholic philosophy in Europe, where the Roman Catholic Church said whatever can be done by communities must be done by communities. The church and the state must only get involved if it cannot be done locally. Now, that's not really what 156(4) says. 156(4) essentially turns it around and says national government must give to local government further powers when it makes sense. So it's an expression of subsidiarity. We are not using it yet. Of course, the city of Cape Town likes to cite it in its press statements and arguments for devolution of commuter rail and policing powers, etc. But we don't know yet what it means legally, because it's quite complicated, because the Constitution says you must assign as a national or provincial government, but it must also be by agreement. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. So lawyers haven't really figured out yet what exactly it means. There's no court yet that expressed itself on it. But my prediction is that over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see that provision litigated, and then we're going to have to make sense of what it really means, because when the Constitution says must, it must mean something. It must be some sort of compulsion. So that's, I think, the innovation of the Constitution in saying that we are protecting local government. We have the schedules, we have the protection of local government against national provincial interference, but we also envisage that municipalities will over time start claiming or receiving, however you want to call it, further authority, provided they can handle it and it makes sense. Yeah, that's my understanding of subsidiarity, which has not been fully embraced yet. And I think that's also largely because of the crisis that we also see in many municipalities, even the larger ones. So that remains work in progress. Thanks, Johan.
Yes, I quite agree. If you look at the Systems Act, sections 9 and 10, which speaks of a province that must assign or the national that must assign, that really has not happened. The housing function, for example, no significant assignments there, yet the government closest to the people does not really have the power to exercise full authority over housing. Just as an example, the same, of course, for transport. You've mentioned the example of the city of Cape Town. So yes, not yet fully embraced, and one would think a little bit compromised along the way. That's my view for now, but it is a wait and see as I think local government develops and evolve. So I think that is going to come to the fore much, much more. And I do think that a coalition government is going to start playing a bigger role in actually making sure that powers are in fact then being devolved. That's my view.
Yeah. Can I come in quickly on
if
that
we
one while you mentioned it, Johan? The issue of coalitions, maybe that's one area of an unforeseen issue. Right? Because I always argue when we talk about perhaps making some tweaks to the law to facilitate coalitions, one of my arguments is always, I was there when the Structures Bill was in Parliament. Nobody even thought remotely of the possibility of coalitions. It was not on the cards. It was really about this party is going to govern or the other party is going to govern, and that's it. We didn't really think about the possibility of a scrambled egg outcome, which we now see in so many of the municipalities. And in that sense, it's a good thing that is now up for debate to see, are there changes that we can make to the Structures Act that could make coalition building and sustaining slightly easier, knowing full well that the law is not going to fix the politics. But for example, insisting that voting for the mayor must always be done in secret. I don't think that was done with coalitions in mind. Giving only 14 days to elect your speaker and constitute your council after the general election, I don't think that was legislated considering the fact that you may have to really work very hard to put together a government in the first 2 weeks, and maybe you need a bit more time for that. So I think that's for me an illustration of, law is never perfect. It's always in a particular context and remains a work in progress. Sorry about that, John.
No, that's fine, because it does then beg the question, what would be the other important aspects of the legal framework that would need reform? And yes, coalition government has now brought to the fore exactly those very practical issues that you have mentioned. But there's also the issue around, and we've mentioned it earlier, or it was discussed, the whole issue around DDM, around integrated planning, bringing all three spheres in. So there's a very big drive now towards that. We have not been doing it well, although that idea was incorporated or still is incorporated in the local government white paper. It is just that life happened, and local government as a own sphere developed its own plans with its own budget, with its own performance management system, etc. So the idea around integrated planning between the spheres kind of fell by the wayside. What in your view are some of the more important aspects of our legal framework that would also need reform?
I think the biggest one for me is the division of responsibilities between district and local municipalities. In my view, that's a mess, and the legal framework has not helped. And there's an interesting historical aspect to that, because if you trace it all the way back to the Constitution, the very first version of the Constitution that was submitted to the Constitutional Court for ratification, because that's how it worked. You know this very well, but for the benefit of the readers or the listeners, obviously the Constitutional Assembly adopted a constitution, and part of the transitional arrangement was that constitutional text was going to be submitted to the Constitutional Court for ratification. And that original text made no mention of category A, B, C. It had none of that. And the Constitutional Court actually pointed that out, and it was one of the reasons why the Constitutional Court threw back the text to the Constitutional Assembly and said, you have to fix this because you are not being specific enough about the structures of local government. As a result, the Constitutional Assembly then inserted 3 categories of local government. Category A, self-standing municipality with all the local government powers, and then B and C as the 2 tiers of local government outside of the category A that would share authority. We actually owe the district local conundrum to the Constitutional Court. Secondly, when the Municipal Structures Act, the first version of the Municipal Structures Act that was adopted in 1998, was fairly coherent about the role of districts, because it really positioned districts as a sort of umbrella local government that was going to do bulk services in certain places. It was going to support local municipalities. It was going to coordinate planning, and it was going to be this overarching support, facilitative, coordinating kind of local government. But fairly quickly, amendments were made. I think in the first year of the life of the Municipal Structures Act, amendments were made. And I'm sure you can remember the arguments in Parliament where suddenly I think it's Section 83 of the Structures Act, which sets out the normal division between district and local, was changed. And suddenly the district municipalities emerged as service providers, as tiers of local government that in principle were going to be responsible for water, sanitation, and other municipal services, which matters. At least put things on a much more loose footing in terms of the understanding of the role of districts. And in my mind, we've never really recovered from that, because shortly after that amendment was adopted, there was also this realization, but hang on, this doesn't actually work in many parts of the country where local municipalities are really the ones that are responsible for service delivery. So then we're going to authorize local municipalities to perform those district functions. So it was a bit of a tumbling around of where does the service delivery authority lie, and has forever, I think, bedeviled the relationship between district and local municipalities. But okay, it is what it is. We live with it now. But I think this is one area where I think the legal framework needs to be revisited and made much more coherent. Also, but still realizing that the relationship between a district municipality and a local municipality, for example, in the Western Cape, with its own history, is very different from the relationship between a district and local municipality in Limpopo or in Mpumalanga, where local government has had a very different trajectory. So we need that kind of flexibility, but a much clearer and coherent understanding of the role of district municipalities, I think, is something that really needs to come out of the white paper review. And I think one of the clearest proposals in that respect is to say that we need to lift some of the largest local municipalities out of the district local conundrum, make them standalone municipalities, perhaps not of the same size and status as the metros, but there really seems to be little reason why a local municipality like Umhlatuze or George or Arkenstein or Stellenbosch should sit within a district municipality. Yes, there would be things that the district municipality would be better placed to do, but that can also be arranged through inter-municipality arrangements and doesn't always justify a local municipality being part of a district. So I think that is an area that really needs reform, where I think the law has not done us any favors.
Okay. As we move towards the end now, just one small little comment of mine when it comes to reform. There's certainly also reform needed to professionalize local government, both at an administrative level, also at the political level. It is an extremely complex environment, as you would know. And the drive that was there in the beginning, that councillors must really transform local government and get rid of the old guard. I think that to a large extent now is gone. Part of the reforms must be to professionalize local government and to insulate the local administration from political influence. Now, having said that, your last reflection, what should younger officials, those that now do not have our experience, younger lawmakers and governance thinkers understand about the legal logic underpinning their work today? What is it that they would need to understand as a takeaway of today's discussion here?
Let me make two comments. The one is the harking back to the romanticism and the ambition of the white paper, and the other one slightly more cynical. We start with the first one. I think young professionals, young practitioners, young lawyers should really look for the golden thread between the white paper of 1998 and the suite of legislation. Why is it that the legislative framework so jealously protects local government autonomy? Was that a mistake? No, because there's really deep thought that went into that, and it is for a good reason that local government autonomy is protected. I think looking for that golden thread, I think, is critically important. The more cynical argument or warning that I would give young lawyers and professionals is that the unfortunate reality of the legal framework is also that it has given us a whole set of tripwires that can be very easily weaponized. If you are a hardworking, well-meaning and competent municipal official, municipal manager, city manager, you're trying to follow the law, there's always something somewhere that can trip you up. And unfortunately, political forces in municipal administrations and in municipal councils are constantly weaponizing the law to suit their political ends. And I think as lawyers and as practitioners working with or in the law, we should be cognizant of that and see through, forgive my French, but see through the bullshit. Because increasingly, the courts are also seeing through that same bullshit. I curate textbook local government law of South Africa. Every year I troll through all the case law, and increasingly I see judges saying, listen, you can come to me with all your procedural arguments, but there's a bigger picture here. And the courts are starting to see that. So it is, I think, worth the while for legal practitioners to not just focus on the tripwires, because you may be doing that at the behest of some political force, and rather focus on what's the big picture, what's the golden threads between the legal framework and the ambition of the white paper. So those would be my two parting shots, Johan.
Thanks, Jaap. I could not agree more. Ethical leadership, I think, is something that you can't legislate, but certainly that is what the young leaders, the young officials must take to heart. That leadership always matters. And it is something that you would have to live as opposed to read and go on workshops. Anyway, Jaap, thank you very much. This was a great discussion. It was illuminating. It took us back, but it also brought us to a point where we can say this is what needs to change. So thank you very much for your participation. Ashraf, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Just to thank you and to thank Jaap. Maybe given the predominant theme that comes out of all the podcasts we've done so far, I think we've done about 6. So the leadership comes in all the time. And given that, I'm just wondering whether we shouldn't change the title of this initiative from local government matters to local government leadership matters, especially since we are directing this towards leadership in local government. But thank you very much. A fascinating discussion. And as always, I like the way in which you went back and came forward. I think it's a very illuminating conversation there. Thank you and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Thank you.
Thank you so much.